Today, Aviation Theater is pleased to have Leo Nadeau as our guest. In addition to being one of the staunch leaders of the Confederate Air Force, he was a tail gunner on a Grumman Avenger during World War II. Leo, welcome to Aviation Theater.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
First, let's talk about that Grumman Avenger. I drive a Buick, and it was made by General Motors. Right. They make cars and GMC trucks, but after Pearl Harbor, they didn't make any more cars, did they?
No, all automobile manufacturing stopped about the second day of December 7th or 8th. Production stopped on everything at that time, and the orders came out of Washington. They were to start converting to military equipment.
So General Motors, for Grumman or with Grumman, built the Avenger?
Well, actually, Grumman turned over most of the dies, and in fact, they did a mock-up model of TBM that could be disassembled. And it was brought to General Motors, and from there is how General Motors learned how to manufacture a TBM, was from this model that could be taken apart.
TBM is torpedo, bomber, and the M stood for General Motors.
Right.
Now, there was another one, it was the PBF.
That was Patrol, yeah.
Patrol Bomber, and F stood for another company that made that.
That was Grumman. Grumman's designation was F, but they stopped making all types of aircraft except for the Hellcat.
But the TBM and the PBF, their parts were interchangeable, so they were essentially the same airplane.
Absolutely, yes.
And speaking about those parts, there was a Parker Kellen fastener known as the PKF.
Right.
Would you tell us about that?
Well, it's somewhat like a snap fastener. It has the central point that retracts into a tube, and the hole is drilled for the rivet, and you push this little tab down in, and it will hold in place. Once you release the pressure on it, it expands, and it will hold in place in that hole. And the whole series of those would be laid out on a wing panel to put the skin on the wing. And in the final assembly, as each one of those was lifted out, and if you compress the spring on it, it would lift right out.
It was a temporary
Right, a rivet was dropped in and welded into place.
It was to hold it in place until you put the rivet in.
That's so you could drill all the holes through the skin into the spar and go right on down the line and just put these temporaries in and get it all set up, and then you start pulling those out and riveting in for a permanent job.
Well, when I made balsa wood model airplanes, I used paper clips to hold everything in place, and then I just went down the line with glue, and so it's the same principle.
Same thing. The wing will look like a porcupine if you see it laid out where they're putting skin on it.
The women played a big part in making these Avengers. Was it the rudder and the rudder and the elevator were fabric?
Were fabric covered, yeah.
And the women sewed those by hand. And then later, the women took over the metalworking part, and it was actually at General Motors where Rosie the Riveter was born. Right. It wasn't a real person. It was kind of like Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill. But Rosie the Riveter, I guess when you pull those fasteners out, it would have been Rosie who went down the line and put those rivets in. Yeah. The airplane had a 1,700 horsepower Wright engine.
14-cylinder.
My airplane has a 75 horsepower engine. So imagine what an engine like that was pulling. It was the largest single-engine carrier plane that the United States Navy had?
Yeah, yes. You have to remember that we carried over 2,000-pound bomb load in that thing, all internally. We also carried the ammunition for 350 caliber machine guns and 130 caliber machine gun, so plus 3 men. So we were carrying a lot of weight.
I've carried a 50 caliber machine gun barrel. Two men are needed to carry a 50 caliber machine gun. One man carries the barrel on his back like this, and the other one carries the carriage group. Takes 2 men just to carry the gun. Yeah. The first of these were delivered September 2nd at Henderson Field at Guadalcanal. This was the first time the Avenger was delivered. and you immediately called it the Turkey.
Right.
And the reason for that was
Low and slow.
that it was clumsy and big, and it looked like a turkey.
Yeah. It was an affectionate name. It wasn't derogatory in any sense of the word at all. It wasn't derogatory at all. It was a term of endearment. Most pilots that flew the things just loved them. They thought they were great. Very forgiving aircraft, so I was told. I never flew one. I wasn't
Well,
a pilot.
you flew in them.
I flew in them, but from all the pilots that I know that flew them, all said the same thing. It was a very forgiving aircraft, but it was slow. It maneuvered slow. It turned slow. It did everything slow.
Like a Stearman, flies at 70,
Right.
climbs at 70.
Right.
Well,
But it did the job that it was designed for.
there's an old joke that Eddie Rickenbacker's mother told him, Eddie, fly low and fly slow. And in the Avenger, you actually did. You literally did fly low and fly slow. And especially when you were making a torpedo run, the planes would get down to between 5 and 200 feet above the water.
Oh, you'd be lower than that sometimes.
And so you actually...
the early torpedoes we had were real bad. They were very, very bad.
What does bad mean? Unreliable?
They wouldn't explode on contact the way they should. You'd have a dud. You'd go through all this process of coming down and laying that fish, and then the sucker wouldn't explode.
And then it would just hit.
It would just hit.
How frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Ensign Gay in his torpedo 8 had that problem. Lost the whole squadron, and I don't think one torpedo that they dropped exploded.
Even though they hit?
Even though they hit.
That would be like shooting rubber bullets or something.
Yeah.
You go through all that trouble.
It was the dive bombers, the SBDs, that really did the job there at Midway.
Now, you had a crew of 3 people.
3.
The pilot was in front,
right,
and he was also his own navigator.
In part of his own course, right.
Then in the middle was a radar man.
Down below.
Down below.
Down below.
And then in the back
back of the pilot, in back of the canopy, was the ball turret, and that's where I rode.
We'd call it the tailgunner. You call it the
well,
the
I was looking right
gunner.
at the tail. Yeah.
So it was a 3-man crew.
3-man crew. Yeah.
What else do we want to know about? Oh, the Hellcats. I know what I was going to ask you about. 1943, 44, the Hellcats came out. Originally, you had the Bearcats.
No, originally we had the Wildcats.
Wildcats.
Bearcat came after the Hellcat.
Okay, Wildcats. Originally, you had the Wildcats.
Right.
And then they came out with the Hellcat.
The Hellcat.
And then the Navy was crazy for Hellcats. They wanted all the Hellcats. It was like Cabbage Patch dolls. You know, you couldn't make them fast enough. So they stopped making Avengers, or cut back on Avengers.
They stopped making them.
Altogether.
Everything was turned over to General Motors.
And they made Hellcats.
Grumman stayed right with the Hellcat. They needed a lot of them, and they were producing a lot of them. And they needed the TBMs, too. They produced a lot of those. That was General Motors.
Well, they switched you then from being a torpedo bomber to, what do they call it, Marine Air Support on ground.
Yeah, we did a lot of that.
And instead of a torpedo, you carried 4 500-pound bombs, and you helped in the island hopping.
Right.
Especially at Kwajalein, which was probably the first time they tried that.
No, Saipan was the first.
Saipan?
Saipan was the first one.
I remember reading that at Kwajalein, you made the difference with your Avengers and your 500-pound bombs.
That wouldn't be our squadron. See, we didn't get out there until
the Avengers. I'm talking about the
okay.
Avengers.
Yeah.
The Avengers.
Oh, yeah. Well, they had Avengers in 42 on Guadalcanal.
The early ones.
Right, TBF. There's one still sitting there in their little museum. The natives got it out of the jungle and have it set up there.
Is that right?
P-38. Oh, yeah. And they got a Wildcat there. Wing still folds on it. And the attendant there at the museum will show you. He pulls a pin and you'll fold the wing back and then swing it back up and lock it for you.
The Marianas Turkey Shoot, that was the first Battle of the Philippine Sea. That was in 43.
June 19th.
June 19th, 1943. Right. And on that day, the American Navy shot down 156 Japanese airplanes, the first day. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time in history that a carrier force had fought a battle against another carrier force. Right. And that's when we broke the back of the United States Navy.
Right.
Yeah. The Navy pilots carried little model airplanes with them.
Not really, no. They were down
They
in the ready room where you could
Oh, you had
study.
them
We
there
had them in
available
the
to
ready room.
study?
Oh, yes. And plus we had charts with the silhouettes on the
Black
charts.
with
Always
the
black,
outline.
because that's all you see in the air.
Right,
is a
you just
black
saw the silhouette. Yeah, and they were made out of a forerunner of plastic.
Which would Bakelite. Yeah.
Bakelite. I remember I had a little table radio.
Yeah, well, all the radio knobs are made of Bakelite.
Made out of Bakelite, yeah, which was a forerunner of plastic. You were witness to the first kamikaze. A new word was introduced into our vocabulary. That the Japanese launched kamikaze attacks against our Navy. These were suicide missions, young men, 14, 15 years old, and in most cases, the kamikaze suicide mission was their first solo flight.
Right. First time they ever got anything off the ground.
But thanks to the Navy, something like 96% of the planes were shot down either by American planes or by American ships, and very few of them even got through or made any contact or damage.
Those that did get through created quite a problem, though.
Because they were loaded heavily with
explosives.
explosives.
Very heavily with explosives. In fact, we had one that come down on us and missed us on starboard bow, hit the water, and when it exploded, it blew chunks of the plane all over the flight deck.
It was a flying bomb, is what
That's
it was.
what it was,
Yeah.
sure. I came home with a couple of small pieces about as big as a silver dollar that I picked off the flight deck and brought home with me. My children used them for show and tell in school.
You were on the USS San Jacinto.
Right.
And let's talk a little bit about your pilot.
My pilot, okay.
The pilot of your Avenger was a young man from Andover, Massachusetts. He played baseball on the Andover High School team. And he came from a financially comfortable family. And on his 18th birthday, instead of taking a deferment and going to college or trying to buy his way out, he enlisted in the Navy on his 18th birthday. His name was George something. What was his last name?
Bush?
Bush. George Bush, yes. I've heard that name before. George Bush became the youngest pilot in the United States Navy. He was your pilot, and you flew, 57 missions with him. And along about the 50th, 51st mission, he asked you to stand down.
Well, actually, it was one of our chief petty officers that was in charge of our crewmen that came to me in the ready room and told me to stand down.
There was a family friend of George.
Of Lieutenant White, who was serving aboard our ship. In fact, he was a gunnery officer aboard the ship. Was to go in my place. So
and you were not happy?
Well, no, I wasn't happy. Nobody was. I don't think any of the guys were happy when their crew was broken up for somebody else. And
you wanted to go on that flight? And
yes and no.
Well, you were out there to fight a war.
I mean, when you're told to do something, I mean, it's your responsibility. It's your duty to do it. And you want to go, but there's something that tells you don't want to go, but you do go. I mean, you do what's necessary.
Yes.
When I was told to stand down, I just stood down.
You grit your teeth and you do it. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about what happened on that flight. The mission was to go to Shishijima, one of the 3 Jima islands. See if I can remember. Iwo Jima, Nakajima, and Iwo Jima, Hahajima, and Shishijima. And this was Shishijima.
Right.
And you had been there once before to knock out the radio station, and didn't get the job completed, and so you go back a second time.
Right.
There were 4 planes. They divided into 2 pairs, and George Bush and the other plane went in
on one set of targets
on one run, and on the way into the target, tell us what happened.
Well, he was hit by anti-aircraft fire, and the aircraft caught fire. And it was burning quite bad. He continued on down and dropped his bombs and scored some good hits with it, and then tried to get some altitude and get away from the island so he could get his crew out. They got out must have been about 9 miles offshore. And he had been given a command to bail out for his crewmen to bail out, and finally he couldn't handle it anymore. The cockpit was full of smoke and flame, and he was going to be a toasted marshmallow if he stayed, so he bailed out. And on his bailout, he hit his head on the horizontal stabilizer. That sort of stunned him a little bit. And his parachute also got caught and tore. And it pulled free and he went down, but he went down a little faster than you would normally because of the torn panel in the parachute. When he got to the height above water, which was about 30 feet when we were told to release from the chute and drop free so it wouldn't drag us under, he released and dropped into the water. And of course, that extra momentum, he went deep. When he hit the water, he went deep and he swallowed seawater. He managed to get back to the surface. And got a little seasick there, from drinking all that salt water. And I guess he's feeling pretty miserable and pretty lonely out there from what I can understand.
Let's hold that thought right there. I want to hear more about that. We'll be back right after this important message. We're back with Leo Nadeau, tailgunner for President Bush. Not tailgunner, Leo. Turret gunner?
Turret gunner.
Turret gunner.
Actually, well, you could use it either way. It's a turret, but you're facing the tail.
Yeah. Turret tail gunner for President Bush. Now, here's George Bush in the ocean with his mouth full of salt water, bobbing around.
No life raft.
No life raft. Because that was destroyed when the plane was on fire.
It's hooked to your parachute. And when he checked the parachute,
I see. When you dump the parachute, you dump the life raft too.
Yeah.
Okay. So another pilot flew over.
Right. Flew down and gave him a direction to swim so to get his raft.
So he went to his own raft.
No, he swam to it. Yeah.
Oh, so they didn't throw another one over for him.
No,
they showed him where to go, and he swam to get his own raft. He inflated his raft.
Got aboard.
And
tried to paddle to keep away from the island because the current was pushing him towards the island, and he didn't want to get any closer. He was about 9 miles at that time, and he was within
Let's
view.
talk about that. It's not publicized a whole lot, but the Japanese soldiers on islands like that reverted to cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
And on this particular island where George was, or was next to, the commandante beheaded American prisoners and ate their livers.
Right.
And he was put on trial for war crimes after the war for doing that.
He was executed for it.
Now, had the Japanese captured George Bush, they would have beheaded him and ate his liver.
It would have been the main course for the day.
Yeah.
It's you can laugh about it now, but to us, when we were out there, it wasn't very funny, really. We all knew the chances that we were taking. If we had to bail out and they got us, we were dead. That was it.
Yeah.
There was no survival with those people. Anyone that was flying personnel would be beheaded. As soon as they got them, they'd tie them to a tree and behead them.
Now, I want to ask you something. What do you think if the people who did this, who beheaded American prisoners and ate their livers, the people who pulled the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, the people who did the Bataan Death March, and we all know what they did to the American nurses that they captured, what do you think the Japanese would have done if they had the atomic bomb in World War II?
They would have dropped it on Pearl Harbor.
Immediately.
They wouldn't
There wouldn't have been any soul searching or conscious searching on their part.
No.
So here's George trying to set a new world's record for rubber raft paddling, and something happened.
Well, as was always the case, or nearly always the case, we had a submarine that was on station on any of these islands that we were making runs on or bombing missions over. We would usually have a rescue sub on station. Remember, in those days, we didn't have helicopters, so submarines were our only rescue. Now, this submarine, the USS Finback, had got the word that he was down. They didn't know the name of the pilot. They just knew that one of our planes was down, and they thought there were two people because they saw two
parachutes, right?
Had been reported. But they couldn't surface because it was too close to the island, had too much daylight, and they had to wait. So I guess he hung around in the water for an hour and a half or so before it finally managed to come up, take a good look, and they popped to the surface and yanked him aboard immediately and pulled him aboard, and they went right back down. Saved his life. They got him out of there and got him back down, but they couldn't get him back to Pearl. They had just come out for their 30-day patrol and just started their patrol, so he had to stay with them aboard that submarine for 30 days.
So he became a submariner for 30 days.
And he wasn't too happy with it, he said. He didn't like the idea of being below the surface of the water.
The war went on, and Colonel Paul Tibbets dropped the atomic bomb. Japan surrendered.
Yeah.
But the Avenger continued in service and was used in the Korean War, too.
Right. There are still some flying today.
But not for torpedoes or bombs.
No.
Tell our viewers how they used the Avenger in Korea.
Oh, boy, they were using them more or less for transports. They would transport personnel from one point to another.
Light transport planes.
They were being used like transport
planes. Welded the bomb bay
doors together, put bench seats up in the bomb bay section, and they took out part of the bulkhead between the bomb bay and where the radioman sat. And they could carry 10 people back there. Because you couldn't get anybody up and back of the pilot. That was all radio gear and autopilot gear up there. You have to remember that in those years, we didn't have the small type radios that we have today. We had all tube type radios, which were big monstrous things. Hey, there goes.
What is that? Oh, boy! A Mustang!
I think that's Chuck's.
That's what I want for Christmas.
Yeah, he just got that a little while ago. Chuck, I think it's Chuck Hall's. I'm not sure.
Yes, it is.
I haven't seen it.
When they welded the bomb bay door shut, they put like benches on the side.
Right. Yeah.
And
they could carry 10 people in there. Then after those wars were over, everything, there were still a lot of aircraft that are flying. There are still some flying. Canada's using them for fire bombers up there.
Oh, they would be good for that.
Sure. We had some right here in Ramona in, I think it was 1971. They had several of them here that were used for the same thing.
You could put like a big plastic balloon inside there with retardant.
They put the retardant tanks right up in the bomb bay.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Leo Nadeau. We're fortunate to get you here today because your lovely wife Jenny, every time I call, she says, well, he's in Florida or he's in Virginia or you're out with the Confederate Air Force. You're at a lot of air shows.
Right.
Tell us what you're doing.
Well, I'm flying in my old gun position in the turret of a TBM. A friend of mine in Texas has one, or he had one. We no longer fly it. But we have been flying in air shows all over the Midwest and on the East Coast. So I would go out on a Friday or a Thursday, and we would take off on a Friday and go to an air show and stay there all weekend for Saturday and Sunday shows, and fly back to Texas, and I would stay there with him for a week, and then we'd do the following weekend, we'd do another set of air shows, and then I'd come on home. Sometimes I'd be home for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and I'd be right back again, and we'd go out and do another.
And home is?
Home is Ramona, California.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to mention one other thing that I didn't bring up during the World War II part. You had an all-Yankee crew on your airplane.
Well, we sure did.
Tell our viewers about that.
Well, President Bush was from Connecticut. Our radioman, Jack Delaney, was from Rhode Island, and I was from Massachusetts. So we were all three New Englanders. Damn Yankees.
And all three of you seem to have turned out okay.
Well, one of us didn't do too bad, I think. But I'm sorry to say that we lost, on that September 2nd, we lost our original radio, remember?
I know you had two different radio men.
We were given another radio man who now is alive. He lives in New York. Joe Riker was our second radio man.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers? I know you're active in the Confederate Air Force.
Well, not so much with the Confederate Air Force. It's more like a private thing with the owner of the TBM. We go out and do a lot of air shows and different things. I have done a little traveling on my own. I've talked at schools to grade school children. I put in appearances at museums for autographing and different things like that. But it keeps me going, keeps me busy, and I love it. I have a lot of fun with it.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
We've been honored to have Leo Nadeau as our guest today. This is a man who fought in combat in World War II. We're trying to recognize and give honor to the people who fought and kept America free. As always, this is Captain Fred saying, I love airplanes and the people who fly them.